I went to a Memorial Day barbecue hoping to see my son. Instead, I found him kneeling on the grass, picking up dropped ribs as his father-in-law pressed a polished dress shoe into his shoulder. The older man laughed, telling his wealthy friends that picking up trash was all my son was truly good for. My son looked up at me, his eyes welling with humiliated tears. But he did not move. I did not shout. I simply walked outside to the sidewalk and made a single phone call. 3 weeks later, their entire multi-million-dollar empire completely collapsed, and they were left begging for the very scraps they had thrown in the dirt. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect lives, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, never bought. My name is Oliver Grant. I am 69 years old, a proud African-American man and a retired carpenter. To my son Michael and his white wife Rachel, I am just a poor, uneducated old man surviving on a fixed pension. They have absolutely no idea that my contracting business evolved into a massive commercial real estate holding firm entirely shielded within a blind trust. The air at Jonathan's sprawling suburban estate smelled of expensive cigars and catered Wagyu beef. I parked my reliable 10-year-old pickup truck between a row of imported luxury sedans. I walked up the winding cobblestone driveway, ignoring the fake, tight-lipped smiles of the wealthy guests. They looked at my worn flannel shirt and work boots as if I were the hired help, arriving late to clean the pool. I did not care about their judgment. I built houses with my bare hands for 40 years. I worked double shifts, sacrificing my own body so Michael could attend the best universities and never have to bow his head to anyone. I could hear the string quartet playing softly in the background, a stark contrast to the heavy, sinking feeling in my chest. I had not seen Michael in 3 months. Every phone call I made was sent to voicemail. Every invitation to Sunday dinner was rejected with a weak excuse about his heavy workload. I thought he was building an empire. I thought he was breaking the glass ceiling I could only ever tap against. I walked straight through the grand foyer, bypassing the catered champagne tower and headed toward the manicured backyard. I just wanted to see my son. We had grown distant since he married into Jonathan's wealthy family, but a father never stops hoping. I expected to find him mingling with the elite, perhaps talking business or sharing a laugh. I never expected to find him completely stripped of his dignity in front of an audience. Near the edge of the expansive stone patio, a silver platter of barbecue ribs had been knocked over onto the pristine grass. Michael was on his hands and knees, frantically scooping the greasy meat into a linen napkin. Jonathan Rachel's arrogant father and the CEO of a major logistics firm stood over him holding a crystal glass of bourbon. Jonathan casually placed the sole of his expensive leather loafer directly against my son's shoulder, pressing him down into the dirt. The stain of barbecue sauce smeared against Michael's crisp white shirt, but the stain on his character was far worse. Jonathan chuckled, swirling his drink, and announced to his circle of executives that manual labor was the only thing Michael was actually qualified to perform. He smirked and added that cleaning up messes was just in my son's blood. The executives laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that made my stomach turn into a knot of pure ice. Jonathan's friends clinked their glasses together, treating my son like a court jester performing a trick. I looked at Rachel. My daughter-in-law stood just a few feet away, casually sipping her white wine, watching her husband be treated like a dog. She did not say a single word to stop it. She simply watched with a look of mild amusement. Michael looked up and saw me standing there. Tears of profound humiliation welled in his eyes, but he did not push Jonathan's foot away. He just kept scraping the dirt, completely paralyzed by his desperate, pathetic need for their wealth and their approval. I stepped forward, this gravel crunching heavily beneath my boots. My voice cut through the laughter like a steel blade. I looked directly at Jonathan and commanded him to step away from my son immediately. I reached down, offering Michael my calloused hand, telling him to stand up, keep his pride, and walk away from these miserable people. Instead of accepting my help, Michael slapped my hand away. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in an ugly mixture of shame and misdirected rage. He shouted at me, his voice echoing across the suddenly silent yard, demanding to know why I was there, embarrassing him in front of his network. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. The string quartet stopped playing. The guests stared at us with morbid fascination, watching a son verbally assassinate his own father. I felt a deep, agonizing fracture in my heart. The boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was too tired to walk, was dead. In his place stood a hollow shell of a man bought and paid for by a family that despised him. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest, accusing me of being a broke, worthless old man who never provided him with a trust fund or generational wealth. He screamed that Jonathan was giving him the life I never could, even if he had to crawl for it. Rachel stepped forward, her lips curled in a disgusted sneer. She told me I had no right to speak to her father that way in his own home. She crossed her arms and said if I truly wanted to be useful and earn a tiny place in their family, I needed to sign over the deed to my historic family land to Jonathan's investment firm. She demanded the 50 acres my grandfather had purchased with his blood and sweat after the Great Migration, claiming it was the only piece of garbage I owned that had any real value to them. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend his own heritage, to defend the land his great-grandfather bled for, but Michael simply nodded, telling me to sign the papers and stop being a burden. I refused entirely. I told them my grandfather's legacy would never belong to a man who wipes his shoes on my son. Michael's face flushed with absolute anger. He signaled the private security guard standing near the gate and ordered them to escort me off the premises immediately. I did not resist. I turned my back on the people who had abandoned every ounce of their humanity for a paycheck. I walked down the long driveway, stopping only when I reached the public sidewalk. The betrayal stung, but the time for emotion was over. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the direct line of my wealth manager, Daniel. I instructed Daniel to lock every single one of my personal and corporate accounts immediately, suspecting they might try to retaliate for my refusal. Daniel was silent for a terrifying moment. I heard the frantic clicking of his keyboard through the speaker. I could hear Daniel's breath hitching on the other end of the line. Oliver Daniel stammered the funds cleared 10 minutes ago. It bypassed our secondary security protocols because the application came with a notarized power of attorney. The streetlights flickered on above me as the reality of the situation crashed down. When he finally spoke again, his voice was tight with sheer panic. He told me I was too late. Someone had just initiated a massive $750,000 collateral loan against my historic property, and the bank had already wired the funds because the documents bore my perfectly verified signature. They had not just humiliated my son, they had orchestrated a highly sophisticated, calculated theft of the only thing my family held sacred. I did not go back to my empty house. I drove straight through the dark city streets to Daniel's downtown office. The glass lobby doors were locked, but Daniel was waiting for me inside, holding a thick manila folder delivered by a late-night courier. We walked into his office and spread the banking documents across his massive mahogany conference table. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated the absolute worst betrayal a father could face. Staring back at me from the bottom of the commercial loan agreement was my own signature. The loops, the harsh angles, the precise pressure points were absolutely perfect. It was a flawless forgery. I felt a sickening, heavy twist in my gut as a memory surfaced from 30 years ago. I spent countless hours sitting at our small kitchen table, teaching a young Michael how to hold a pen, how to craft his signature with pride and confidence. I told him a man's signature was his bond and his honor. Now, my own son had weaponized that very lesson to steal the 50 acres of land my grandfather purchased after fleeing the brutal South during the Great Migration. That land was paid for in sweat, blood, and decades of starvation. Michael had illegally leveraged my family's sacred history to secure a $750,000 financial lifeline for Jonathan's failing logistics company. I looked at Daniel and instructed him to prepare the federal fraud affidavits immediately, but to hold them until I gave the signal. I needed to look my son in the eye one last time. The next morning, I drove to the gleaming glass skyscraper that housed Michael's corporate headquarters. I walked past the startled receptionist, ignoring her loud protests, and pushed open the heavy double doors of Michael's corner office. He was sitting behind a massive frosted glass desk wearing a bespoke tailored suit that likely cost more than my first pickup truck. When he saw me, his fake professional smile vanished instantly. He stood up, knocking his expensive leather chair backward, demanding to know how I managed to get past the lobby security. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene or give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. I simply reached into my jacket, pulled out the forged loan documents, and placed them directly in the center of his pristine desk. I tapped my calloused index finger directly on the fraudulent signature. I watched his eyes dart to the paper, and for a fraction of a second I saw genuine, terrifying panic flash across his face. But the panic was quickly swallowed by the toxic, unearned arrogance he had absorbed from his father-in-law. I kept my voice dangerously calm and steady. I told him he had exactly 24 hours to contact his corrupt bankers, withdraw the fraudulent loan, and confess the forgery to the authorities. I made it entirely clear that I was not negotiating. If the stolen money was not returned by noon the next day, I promised him I would walk directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation and hand them the evidence myself. I told him he would lose his corporate career, his freedom, and the miserable, ungrateful family he had sold his soul to join. I warned him that the federal government does not take bank fraud lightly, and Jonathan would absolutely abandon him the moment the handcuffs came out. I stood there waiting for a shred of remorse. I wanted to see the boy I raised realize the catastrophic gravity of his actions. I wanted him to break down and apologize for crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But the silence in the room only cemented his choice. Michael stared at me for a long, tense moment before letting out a sharp, barking laugh. He picked up the documents and tossed them carelessly back onto the desk as if they were trash. He leaned forward, resting his palms on the glass, and looked at me with absolute unchecked disdain. He told me I was completely out of my mind and living in a fantasy world. He claimed I had no real power, no influence, and absolutely no way to prove the signature was a forgery against Jonathan's massive army of corporate lawyers. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my faded flannel shirt, my worn denim jeans, and the scuff marks on my steel-toed work boots. He laughed again, a cruel sound that mirrored Jonathan's laughter from the barbecue. He said an uneducated retired carpenter could never survive a legal battle against a family with real generational wealth and political connections. He told me I should be grateful he was putting that useless patch of dirt to good use to secure his financial future. He said Jonathan was right about me, that I was just a bitter old man holding on to a worthless past because I was too incompetent to build anything of actual value in the modern world. He told me I was obsolete. He sneered and added that I should simply accept my place at the bottom of the food chain. He told me my grandfather's land was nothing more than an uncultivated weed patch, and he was finally extracting its true monetary value. Before I could respond to his sickening insults, Michael reached over and pressed a silver button on his desk intercom. He told his secretary to send the gentleman in right away. The heavy office door clicked open, and a man in a cheap gray suit stepped inside. He did not look at me directly. He simply thrust a thick, sealed legal envelope against my chest and stated that I was officially served. I opened the envelope and scanned the crisp white pages. It was an emergency petition for a permanent conservatorship. Michael and Rachel had filed sworn affidavits citing my supposedly erratic behavior, severe memory loss, and violent outbursts as grounds to strip me of all my legal and financial rights. Michael smiled a cold, dead smile. He told me that by Friday a judge would declare me legally incompetent, and he would be granted full control over my life, my assets, and my ancestral land. He told me to go back to my empty house and wait for the nurses to take me away. I walked out of Michael's glass-enclosed office holding the heavy legal envelope like it was a live grenade. I did not go back to my empty house. I drove straight through the busy city streets to a private secure conference room Daniel maintained off the books in the financial district. Daniel was already waiting, pacing nervously across the dark carpet. I tossed the conservatorship petition onto the mahogany table. Daniel read through the ridiculous claims of my supposed severe memory loss and violent outbursts. The reality of the threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. If a judge believed Michael's fabricated lies and granted this emergency conservatorship, my son would not just take control of my daily life. He would gain immediate legitimate access to the hidden commercial real estate empire I had spent 40 years building in absolute silence. My late wife Cynthia and I lived modestly by choice, putting every extra penny from my contracting jobs into a blind trust that now owned shopping centers and office buildings across the state. Michael truly believed I was a destitute carpenter surviving on Social Security. If he legally breached the trust, he and Jonathan would drain my life's work in a matter of days. Daniel looked at me, his face pale. He explained that we had a massive problem. The burden of proof in these emergency hearings was terrifyingly low, and Jonathan had the corrupt judges in this city wrapped around his finger. We needed an ironclad medical defense, and we needed it immediately. I told Daniel to start drafting the counter-injunction while I went home to secure my personal files. I pulled into my driveway an hour later. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the historic land my family had fought so hard to keep. Sitting on my front porch, shivering slightly in the evening breeze, was Rachel. My daughter-in-law wore a beige trench coat and a look of profound distress. As I walked up the wooden steps, she immediately launched into a theatrical performance. Tears streamed down her pale face, leaving streaks of expensive mascara. She rushed forward, grabbing my hands with a desperate grip. She told me she was so incredibly sorry for the way I was treated at the barbecue. She claimed she had no idea Jonathan was going to humiliate me or that Michael had filed those horrible conservatorship papers. Between calculated sobs, she insisted that Jonathan had forced Michael into forging the loan documents, threatening to ruin him financially if he did not comply. She begged me to believe that Michael still loved me and was just trapped under her father's thumb. I looked into her eyes. They were completely devoid of genuine warmth. After 40 years in the construction business, negotiating with ruthless suppliers and corrupt city inspectors, I knew how to spot a liar. Rachel was playing a part, but I decided to let her continue the script. I kept my face blank and nodded slowly. She wiped her eyes and asked if she could please come inside for just a minute to get a glass of water to calm her nerves. I unlocked the front door and invited her in. I guided her toward the kitchen, but I deliberately kept myself positioned between her and the hallway leading to my private study. I handed her a glass of ice water from the refrigerator. She drank it slowly, her eyes darting around the house, taking in the modest furnishings and worn rugs. I watched her every move, acutely aware that a woman who stood by while her husband was treated like dirt did not suddenly develop a conscience in a matter of hours. She lingered by the kitchen island, asking mundane questions about my day, trying far too hard to sound like a caring relative. I gave her short, clipped answers. Finally, she set the glass down, thanked me profusely for my forgiveness, which I had never actually offered, and excused herself. She said she needed to use the restroom before the long drive back to her suburban estate. I pointed her down the hall and waited in the kitchen, counting the seconds. Rachel emerged from the hallway a few minutes later. Her tears were completely gone, replaced by a brisk, urgent energy. She grabbed her designer purse from the kitchen counter, offered one final fake smile, and hurried out the front door. The moment her luxury vehicle sped out of my driveway, a profound, chilling silence fell over the house. My instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The narrative she had spun simply did not add up, and her sudden departure was far too convenient. I walked quickly down the hall, bypassing the restroom completely, and went straight into my private study. The room was exactly as I had left it, or so it seemed at first glance. My heavy oak desk was clear. The bookshelf was undisturbed. But as I moved closer to the corner, my stomach dropped. My heavy steel filing cabinet, which housed my most sensitive personal documents, was slightly ajar. I dropped to one knee and inspected the lock. The metal cylinder was scratched and expertly pried open. Rachel had not come to apologize or to beg for mercy. She had used the glass of water in the restroom break as a calculated distraction. She had broken into my secure files right under my roof. I felt a surge of cold fury. I had severely underestimated the depths to which Jonathan and his daughter would sink to secure my property. They were not just arrogant, they were methodical criminals. I pulled the heavy metal drawer open all the way. The files were meticulously organized by year and category, just as I always kept them. I ran my hands through the thick manila folders, checking the financial sections, the property deeds, and the tax returns. They were all completely intact. Rachel had not taken anything related to my wealth because she still believed I was broke. I frantically searched the lower drawers, my mind racing to figure out what she was actually after. Then I saw the empty space. My entire medical history file was gone. That specific folder contained decades of health records, prescription details, and most importantly, the direct contact information and private clinic address of my primary care physician. I slammed the drawer shut, the metallic echo ringing through the quiet room. The reality of their sinister strategy hit me like a physical blow. The conservatorship petition relied entirely on proving that my mind was failing. They knew they could not win that case fairly because I was completely lucid and sharp. Rachel stole the file because they intended to intercept my doctor. They were going to impersonate concerned family members and directly tamper with my medical records. They planned to bribe or manipulate the clinic into producing fabricated evidence of severe dementia. If they presented a doctored medical evaluation to the judge on Friday morning, the court would strip my rights away instantly. I was walking straight into a legal slaughterhouse. The empty space in the filing cabinet was a glaring red flag. Rachel had not just stolen paper. She had stolen my medical identity. I stood in the quiet of my study, piecing together their sinister puzzle. The emergency conservatorship petition required a medical basis to convince a judge to strip away my rights. Without a doctor's signature confirming my supposed dementia, the judge would throw their case out of court. By taking my file, Rachel now possessed the direct contact information of my primary care physician. I knew exactly what they were going to do. Jonathan would use his immense wealth and corporate intimidation tactics to pressure my local clinic. They would impersonate concerned family members, paint me as a danger to myself, and fabricate a narrative of severe cognitive decline. They might even bribe a corrupt physician on Jonathan's payroll to draft a fake psychiatric evaluation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, giving me less than 48 hours to counter their move. If I walked into that courtroom empty-handed, the judge would look at my age, look at Michael's expensive suit, and hand over my entire life to my son. I could not rely on my local doctor. Jonathan's influence in our county was simply too vast. I needed an ironclad defense that no corporate lawyer could dismantle. I walked out of my study, grabbed my truck keys, and locked my front door. The race against time had officially begun. I bypassed the local clinic entirely. I got into my truck and drove 3 towns over, putting 50 miles between myself and Jonathan's sphere of influence. I needed a medical professional who could not be bought, intimidated, or manipulated by wealthy logistics executives. During my years building commercial real estate, I had partnered with a massive medical group to construct a state-of-the-art neurological institute. I knew the chief of neurology there was a man of absolute integrity. I parked my truck, walked into the pristine glass lobby, and demanded an immediate emergency consultation. I did not tell the doctor about the conservatorship or my son's ultimate betrayal. I simply told him I required a comprehensive, rigorous cognitive evaluation for complex estate planning purposes. I needed official proof that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. The neurologist agreed and led me into a sterile, brightly lit examination room. What followed was a grueling 4-hour mental marathon designed to expose even the slightest hint of cognitive decline. The doctor administered a battery of complex psychological assessments and memory retention tests. I was asked to recall long sequences of numbers backward and forward. I solved intricate spatial reasoning puzzles and navigated complex logical scenarios. The doctor tried to trip me up with overlapping questions, testing my short-term recall and my long-term factual accuracy. I sat in that cold room, tapping into the same mental discipline I used to calculate load-bearing weights and structural blueprints for multi-story buildings. My mind had always been my greatest asset. My body might have aged, but my brain was a meticulously organized filing system. I answered every question with crisp, absolute precision. I recalled the exact dates of historical events, the precise square footage of my commercial properties, and the specific financial yields of my offshore investments. I treated the evaluation like a war zone because my freedom depended entirely on my performance. After 4 hours of relentless questioning, the neurologist finally set his clipboard down on the examination table. He looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and genuine surprise. He stated clearly that my cognitive function was not just normal for my age, but truly exceptional. He told me I possessed the mental acuity of a man 20 years younger. I did not smile. I looked the doctor directly in the eye and asked him to put those exact words in writing. I required a certified notarized affidavit detailing the comprehensive nature of the exam and explicitly declaring my absolute mental competence. The doctor left the room and returned 20 minutes later holding a thick stack of official hospital documents. He handed me a crisp watermarked certificate bearing his signature, the hospital seal, and the stamp of a legal notary. This piece of paper was my ultimate shield. It was undeniable objective proof of my sanity. It rendered any fabricated medical records Rachel and Michael planned to present completely useless. If they walked into the courtroom on Friday with a fake diagnosis of dementia, I would drop this certified evaluation onto the judge's bench and watch their entire legal strategy shatter into a million pieces. I carefully folded the heavy affidavit and placed it into the inside breast pocket of my jacket, feeling a profound sense of tactical victory. I walked out of the examination room and approached the front billing desk to settle the massive consultation fee. The 4-hour emergency neurological evaluation was incredibly expensive, but it was the price of my freedom. I confidently pulled out my premium health insurance card and handed it to the receptionist. She swiped the plastic card through her terminal. A sharp negative beep echoed across the quiet waiting room. She frowned and ran the card a second time. The same harsh beep responded. The receptionist looked up at me with a highly apologetic expression and slid the card back across the marble counter. She informed me that the system was rejecting the charge. She checked her computer screen and explained that the primary account holder had unilaterally terminated the entire health coverage policy at exactly 8:00 that morning. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The primary account holder was Michael. He had not just filed for conservatorship. He was actively trying to bankrupt me. He canceled my medical insurance to ensure I could not afford to fight back or seek independent medical evaluations. The financial strangulation had officially begun. I stood at the reception desk absorbing the sheer malice of my son's strategy. Canceling my health insurance was not a random act of spite. It was a calculated tactical strike designed to bleed me dry. Michael and Jonathan knew that defending against a fraudulent conservatorship required high-priced lawyers and expensive medical evaluations. They wanted to sever my financial lifelines, so I would walk into that courtroom on Friday morning as a helpless, destitute old man. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out a heavy titanium credit card linked to one of my private commercial contingency accounts. I handed it to the receptionist. She ran the card and handed me the receipt with a sympathetic smile, completely unaware of the silent war being waged over my life. I signed the slip and walked out of the clinic into the bright afternoon sun. My mind raced as I started my truck. If Michael was bold enough to cancel my medical insurance, he was undoubtedly targeting my liquid assets. I had spent decades building a hidden commercial real estate empire, but my day-to-day expenses were tied to local personal accounts. If they managed to freeze those, I would be temporarily paralyzed, unable to pay legal retainers or basic utilities. I needed cash, and I needed it immediately. I pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the highway, heading straight back to my hometown. I had a specific account in mind. I drove directly to the main branch of the local community bank. I had done business with this institution for over 30 years, back when I was still swinging a hammer and building custom homes across the county. I walked through the glass doors, taking in the familiar marble floors and brass fixtures. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked straight to the customer service desk. I intended to secure a specific joint savings account I had opened almost 3 decades ago. It was originally meant to be a college fund for Michael. I remembered working grueling double shifts framing houses in the blistering summer heat, just to deposit a portion of my wages into that account every single month. When Michael received a full academic scholarship, I simply left the money there, letting it accrue interest as a rainy day fund. Currently, it held exactly $60,000 of my own hard-earned money. It was the perfect amount to cover Daniel's emergency legal retainer and any immediate operational costs while we fought the conservatorship petition. I sat down across from a young bank representative and handed her my identification, requesting a cashier's check for the entire balance. She typed my information into her computer and suddenly frowned. She typed a few more keystrokes, her expression shifting from polite customer service to genuine discomfort. She apologized softly and stated that she lacked the authorization to access those funds. Before I could demand an explanation, the heavy oak door of the branch manager's office swung open. Out stepped Arthur Vance, a man I had known for 2 decades. Arthur was the regional manager, and more importantly, he was a frequent guest at Jonathan's exclusive country club. They played golf together every Sunday morning. Arthur smoothed his expensive silk tie and walked over to the desk, asking the young representative to step away. He looked down at me with a sickeningly condescending smirk. Arthur leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. He did not offer his hand to shake. Instead, he looked at me with the kind of pity reserved for a lost child. He stated in a loud voice, ensuring the other customers in the lobby could hear that my account had been flagged. I demanded to know under what authority he was restricting access to my personal funds. Arthur smiled a cold, predatory smile. He explained that his office received a formal legal notice from Michael's attorneys just an hour ago regarding a pending emergency conservatorship. He claimed the bank had a fiduciary duty to protect vulnerable seniors from making irrational financial decisions during periods of cognitive decline. He used the word vulnerable like a weapon intended to strip away my dignity. I told him he had no legal right to freeze a joint account without a signed court order, which Michael absolutely did not possess. Arthur simply shrugged his shoulders. He smoothly countered that bank policy allowed for a temporary administrative hold in cases of suspected elder exploitation. The absolute irony of his words made my blood boil. He was twisting the rules using corporate loopholes to aid Jonathan's hostile takeover of my life. He patted my shoulder and patronizingly suggested I go home and let my son manage my complicated affairs from now on. The corruption was absolute. Jonathan had mobilized his entire local network to build an impenetrable fortress around my assets. I brushed Arthur's hand off my shoulder and walked out of the bank without another word. Arguing with a corrupt manager was a complete waste of breath. Jonathan controlled the local financial ecosystem, but he did not control me. I got back into my truck and gripped the steering wheel tightly. The legal and financial attacks were suffocating, but I knew I still held the ultimate trump card with my certified medical evaluation and my hidden offshore wealth. I turned onto my street, craving the quiet sanctuary of my ancestral home to plan my next move with Daniel. As my historic property came into view, my heart slammed against my ribs. The financial strangulation was only the beginning of their assault. Parked aggressively on my front lawn, crushing my carefully maintained grass, were two massive heavy-duty demolition trucks. The bright yellow machines idled loudly, blowing thick black diesel smoke into the crisp afternoon air. I turned my truck onto the familiar dirt road leading to my property. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I sped up the long gravel driveway, bracing myself for whatever trap Jonathan had laid next. The pristine quiet of my ancestral land had been entirely shattered. Parked aggressively on my front lawn, crushing the grass I had meticulously maintained for decades, were three massive, heavy-duty demolition trucks. The bright yellow bulldozers idled loudly, blowing thick black diesel smoke into the crisp afternoon air. A burly foreman wearing a hard hat and a high-visibility vest marched toward my truck the moment I stepped out. He did not ask for my name. He simply waved a clipboard in my face and shouted over the roar of the engines that I needed to vacate the premises immediately. I glanced at the paperwork clamped to his board. It was a fabricated demolition order bearing the official letterhead of Jonathan's logistics firm. Jonathan knew the conservatorship hearing was still days away and the bank foreclosure would take time. He was tired of waiting for the legal system to hand him my property. He was trying to bypass the courts entirely by destroying my home with me still inside it, figuring an unhoused, terrified old man would be much easier to institutionalize. He sent hired muscles to do his dirty work because he was too much of a coward to face me himself. I did not retreat a single inch. I did not shout or beg them to stop. I walked right past the shouting foreman and positioned myself directly in front of the lead bulldozer's massive steel blade. The machine towered over me, its engine revving with a deafening mechanical roar that vibrated through the soles of my boots. The driver leaned out of his cab, yelling at me to move before I got crushed. I stood my ground, planting my feet firmly into the dirt my grandfather had purchased with a lifetime of sharecropping wages. My grandfather had warned me that greedy men would always try to take what we had built. He told me to always secure my foundation before building the house. That was exactly why I took quiet legal precautions decades ago, long before Michael was even born. I reached inside the breast pocket of my jacket right next to my certified medical evaluation and pulled out a thick envelope. I withdrew a heavy parchment document embossed with the gold seal of the State Historical Society. I held it up not for the driver, but for the foreman who was marching toward me with his face flushed red with anger. He demanded to know what kind of fake paperwork I was trying to pull to delay his job. I kept my voice dangerously level, projecting calm, absolute authority over the chaotic noise of the idling machinery. I told him to look very closely at the seal and the federal parcel numbers listed on the page. I watched his eyes track the official state signatures and the binding legal language. I calmly informed the foreman that the 50 acres he was currently trespassing on were officially designated as a protected cultural heritage site. I explained that my family had secured this federal and state protection to preserve the historical significance of the land post-Great Migration, ensuring it could never be commercially developed or seized through eminent domain. I lowered my voice, ensuring he heard every single syllable clearly. I told him that executing a fraudulent commercial demolition order on federally protected historical land carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I let the weight of that reality sink in. The aggressive red flush drained from the foreman's face entirely. He realized in an instant that Jonathan had lied to him, using his demolition crew as disposable pawns to commit a massive federal felony. The foreman cursed loudly, throwing his hard hat onto the ground in sheer panic. He pulled out his radio and barked frantic orders to his crew, telling them to cut the engines and back the machines off the grass immediately. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and newfound respect, apologizing profusely, while explaining that Jonathan's company had assured them the land was fully cleared for commercial leveling. Within 5 minutes, the roaring engines faded into the distance as the heavy yellow trucks reversed down my driveway and disappeared down the road, leaving deep tire tracks in my lawn. The profound silence returned to my property, but I knew the war was far from over. Physical intimidation had failed spectacularly, so my son and his wife immediately turned to a far more cowardly battlefield. They pivoted to digital warfare. That night, as I sat in my study reviewing my legal counterstrikes, my cell phone began to vibrate relentlessly. Notification after notification flooded my screen. I opened my messages to find a link forwarded by a concerned former colleague. Rachel had uploaded a heavily edited viral video to social media. She had secretly filmed the entire standoff from a parked car down the street. She expertly manipulated the footage, cutting out the audio of my calm legal warnings and the foreman's aggression. She sped up the frames and added a terrifying caption painting me as a violent, deranged hoarder terrorizing innocent construction workers with unpredictable hostility. The video already had hundreds of thousands of views, successfully branding me a public menace and setting the perfect stage for their next devastating attack. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and sped up the long gravel driveway. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. The pristine quiet of my ancestral land had been entirely shattered by an unprovoked invasion. Parked aggressively on my front lawn, crushing the grass I had meticulously maintained for decades, were massive, heavy-duty demolition trucks. The bright yellow bulldozers idled loudly, blowing thick black diesel smoke into the crisp afternoon air. A burly foreman wearing a battered hard hat and a high-visibility vest marched toward my truck the exact moment I stepped out. He did not ask for my name or offer a polite greeting. He simply waved a plastic clipboard in my face and shouted over the deafening roar of the heavy engines that I needed to vacate the premises immediately. I glanced down at the paperwork clamped to his board. It was a blatantly fabricated commercial demolition order bearing the official corporate letterhead of Jonathan's logistics firm. Jonathan knew the conservatorship hearing was still days away, and any bank foreclosure would take precious time. He was tired of waiting for the sluggish legal system to hand him my property. He was trying to bypass the courts entirely by destroying my historic home with me still inside it. He figured an unhoused, terrified old man would be much easier to institutionalize and control. He sent hired muscle to do his dirty work because he was too much of a coward to drive down here and face me himself. I looked at the massive treads tearing up the soil where my late wife had planted a row of oak trees. They wanted to erase my history to build a parking lot or a strip mall. I locked my truck doors and squared my shoulders. They had severely underestimated the resolve of a man who built his life from the ground up. I did not retreat a single inch. I did not shout or beg them to stop tearing up my yard. I walked right past the shouting foreman and positioned myself directly in front of the lead bulldozer's massive steel blade. The machine towered over me, its engine revving with a deafening mechanical roar that vibrated through the soles of my steel-toed work boots. The driver leaned out of his high cab, yelling at me to move out of the way before I got crushed into the dirt. I stood my ground, planting my feet firmly into the soil my grandfather had purchased with a lifetime of meager sharecropping wages. My grandfather had warned me that greedy men would always try to take what we had painstakingly built from nothing. He told me to always secure my foundation before building the house. That was exactly why I took quiet legal precautions decades ago, long before Michael was even born. I reached inside the breast pocket of my jacket right next to my certified medical evaluation and pulled out a thick sealed envelope. I withdrew a heavy parchment document embossed with the bright gold seal of the State Historical Society. I held it up, not for the shouting driver, but for the foreman who was marching toward me with his face flushed red with unyielding anger. He demanded to know what kind of fake paperwork I was trying to pull to delay his expensive demolition job. I kept my voice dangerously level, projecting calm, absolute authority over the chaotic noise of the idling machinery. I told him to look very closely at the raised seal and the specific federal parcel numbers listed on the bottom of the page. I watched his eyes track the official state signatures and the binding legal language. I made sure he understood that this was not a simple local zoning permit, but a legally binding federal decree. He squinted at the heavy paper, his aggressive demeanor faltering as he read the undeniable proof of my absolute ownership and the untouchable status of the ground his machines were currently trespassing on. I pointed to the boundary markers lining the edge of the property, showing him exactly where the municipal jurisdiction ended and the protected heritage boundary began. I told him his machines had already crossed a legal line that could bankrupt his entire contracting business. The foreman swallowed hard, realizing this was not the routine eviction Jonathan had promised him. I calmly informed the foreman that the 50 acres his machines were currently crushing were officially designated as a protected cultural heritage site. I explained that my family had secured this strict federal and state protection to preserve the deep historical significance of the land post-Great Migration, ensuring it could never be commercially developed or seized through eminent domain by corrupt corporate entities. I lowered my voice, ensuring he heard every single syllable clearly despite the noise. I told him that executing a fraudulent commercial demolition order on federally protected historical land carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for everyone involved. I let the severe weight of that legal reality sink in. The aggressive red flush drained from the foreman's face entirely, leaving him pale and visibly shaken. He realized in an instant that Jonathan had blatantly lied to his face, using his independent demolition crew as disposable pawns to commit a massive federal felony. The foreman cursed loudly, throwing his hard hat onto the ground in sheer panic. He pulled out his radio and barked frantic orders to his crew, telling them to kill the engines and back the machines off the grass immediately. He looked at me with a mixture of profound fear and newfound respect, apologizing profusely, while explaining that Jonathan's logistics company had formally assured them the land was fully cleared for commercial leveling. Within 5 minutes, the roaring engines faded into the distance as the heavy yellow trucks reversed down my driveway and disappeared down the main road, leaving deep, muddy tire tracks across my lawn. I watched them leave, making sure to memorize the license plates of their transport vehicles just in case Jonathan tried to deny his involvement. The air slowly cleared of diesel exhaust, replaced by the familiar scent of pine and fresh soil. I had won the physical standoff without throwing a single punch. The profound silence returned to my ancestral property, but I knew the war was far from over. Physical intimidation had failed spectacularly, so my son and his wife immediately turned to a far more cowardly battlefield. They pivoted directly to digital warfare. That night, as I sat alone in my quiet study reviewing my legal counterstrikes, my cell phone began to vibrate relentlessly. Notification after notification flooded my bright screen. I opened my messages to find a web link forwarded by a concerned former colleague. Rachel had uploaded a heavily edited viral video to several major social media platforms. She had secretly filmed the entire standoff from a parked luxury car hidden down the street earlier that afternoon. She expertly manipulated the raw footage, completely cutting out the audio of my calm legal warnings and the foreman's aggressive shouting. She specifically edited the frames and added a terrifying caption painting me as a violent, deranged hoarder who was terrorizing innocent construction workers with unpredictable hostility. The video already had hundreds of thousands of views, successfully branding me a dangerous public menace and setting the perfect stage for their next devastating attack. The comments section was a cesspool of strangers demanding I be locked away for public safety. Rachel was using the internet to manufacture the exact narrative of insanity she needed to win the conservatorship hearing. The metallic click of the police officer unhooking his handcuffs echoed like a gunshot in the pristine guest bedroom. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the small, clear plastic bag of white powder dangling from the gloved hand of the Adult Protective Services agent. The agent looked at me with a mixture of disgust and vindication, fully convinced she had just exposed a dangerous, deranged man hiding behind a facade of order. The trap was incredibly sophisticated in its sheer malice. Rachel had not just intended to humiliate me. She intended to lock me in a concrete cell. I knew the legal machinery better than they realized. If those steel cuffs snapped around my wrists, I would be formally booked on felony drug possession charges. The moment my mugshot entered the system, Michael would have absolute, undeniable leverage. He would instantly present the arrest record to the judge presiding over the conservatorship hearing, arguing that I was a severe danger to myself and the community. The judge would grant the emergency petition by default, stripping me of my rights, my properties, and my freedom before I even had the chance to post bail. My entire commercial real estate empire, built over 40 grueling years, would be handed over to a son who despised me and a father-in-law who wanted to destroy me. The officer stepped toward me, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his duty weapon, instructing me to turn around and place my hands behind my back. I did not raise my voice and I did not flinch. I looked the officer directly in the eye, maintaining the absolute calm of a man who had anticipated his enemy's exact move. I respectfully asked the officer to wait just one moment before making an arrest that would cost him his career. I kept my hands completely visible, holding them out in front of me, and told him that I was the victim of a highly orchestrated, malicious frame job. The agent scoffed, rolling her eyes and telling the officer not to listen to a frantic hoarder trying to talk his way out of a felony. But the officer hesitated. He looked at my calm demeanor, the immaculate condition of the house, and the sheer absurdity of a 69-year-old retired carpenter running a narcotics operation from a spare bedroom. I told the officer that if he followed me to my private study just 20 feet down the hall, I could provide undeniable high-definition proof of exactly how those drugs ended up under my mattress. I offered to let him keep his hand on his weapon and walk directly behind me. The officer nodded sharply, instructing the agent to stay put with the evidence. We walked down the quiet hallway and entered my study. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, moving slowly to ensure the officer felt completely in control. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a sleek black laptop that was hardwired into a separate off-the-grid internet connection. I opened the lid and typed in a complex 16-character encrypted password. The screen illuminated, displaying a grid of 6 different camera angles covering the interior and exterior of my home. I explained to the officer that weeks ago, right after my daughter-in-law faked a tearful apology just to steal my highly sensitive medical files, I realized my physical security had been breached. I knew they would try to strike again. To protect myself, I secretly hired a private security firm to install motion-activated high-definition micro-cameras in the corners of every single room. They were completely invisible to the naked eye, hidden inside smoke detectors, air vents, and bookshelf moldings. The officer leaned over my shoulder, his skepticism slowly giving way to intense professional curiosity as he watched the live feeds of my quiet, empty house. I navigated the secure server's archive, pulling up the exact digital logs from the previous afternoon. I knew exactly when the breach occurred because it was the only time I had allowed anyone from Jonathan's camp inside my sanctuary. I typed in the specific timestamp corresponding to Rachel's sudden, unannounced visit, right when she claimed she needed to use the restroom to compose herself. I clicked on the feed labeled Guest Bedroom. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before displaying a crystal-clear, full-color image of the room we had just left. The officer leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing at the screen. We watched the recording together in absolute silence. The footage showed Rachel slipping quietly into the guest room, completely bypassing the hallway bathroom she claimed she desperately needed. She looked over her shoulder, her face twisted in a look of nervous, frantic energy. She quickly moved to the side of the bed. The high-definition lens captured every single detail perfectly. We watched her open her expensive designer purse, dig past her wallet, and pull out the exact same plastic bag of white powder the agent was currently holding. She shoved her hand under the edge of the heavy mattress, burying the narcotics deep out of sight. She smoothed the comforter back into place, checked her reflection in the vanity mirror, fixed her fake, tearful expression, and hurried out of the room. I paused the video right on a clear, zoomed-in frame of her face and the bag in her hand. The police officer stared at the frozen image on the laptop screen, a muscle working in his jaw. The realization that he had almost been used as a pawn in a wealthy family's corrupt legal strategy made his face flush with genuine localized anger. He unclipped his radio, let out a sharp breath, and dropped the steel handcuffs heavily onto my oak desk. He told me he had seen nasty divorce disputes and corporate blackmail, but planting felony narcotics on a senior citizen crossed a line into pure unchecked villainy. He marched back into the hallway, confiscated the bag of drugs from the bewildered agent, and informed her that they were actively investigating a massive frame job. Before leaving my property, the officer turned back to me, his expression shifting from anger to grave urgency. He warned me that during his background check on my address this morning, an alert flagged in the municipal system. Michael had secretly filed a secondary emergency guardianship petition in a neighboring county jurisdiction, bypassing the local courts entirely. The officer checked his watch and told me the hearing was scheduled to begin in exactly 1 hour, and if I did not show up, my son would win by default. The metallic click of the front door shutting behind the police officer left me standing entirely alone in my quiet hallway. I looked at the antique grandfather clock ticking relentlessly on the wall. I had exactly 1 hour to save my own life. Michael and Jonathan were not just arrogant men making mistakes. They were operating like a highly sophisticated criminal syndicate. When their pathetic attempt to frame me for a felony drug charge collapsed, they immediately activated a secondary trap. They had secretly filed an emergency guardianship petition in a neighboring county court exactly 50 miles away. It was a brilliantly calculated jurisdictional bypass. They intentionally selected a remote courthouse to ensure I would never receive the physical summons in time to defend myself. They knew the municipal law perfectly well. In emergency conservatorship hearings, if the defending party fails to appear, the presiding judge grants the petition by default to protect the supposedly vulnerable senior. If I did not walk through those specific courtroom doors before the final gavel fell, Michael would be granted absolute legal authority over my body, my finances, and my ancestral land. He would win the entire war without ever having to look me in the eye. I felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline flood my veins. I grabbed my jacket, my heavy folder of certified medical documents, and my encrypted tablet. I ran out the front door and dialed Daniel's private number as I sprinted toward my truck. I told my wealth manager to drop whatever he was doing and meet me immediately on the interstate. We were going to crash a hearing we were never meant to attend. Daniel was already waiting for me at the highway on-ramp, sitting behind the wheel of his high-performance black sedan with the engine roaring. I left my old pickup truck on the gravel shoulder and jumped into his passenger seat. We tore down the interstate, breaking every single speed limit law in the county. The landscape blurred past the tinted windows as I explained the full extent of Jonathan's sinister trap. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he navigated aggressively through the heavy morning traffic. We had exactly 45 minutes to cover 50 miles. We wove between massive commercial transport trucks and sped down narrow passing lanes fueled by pure desperation and righteous anger. While we raced against the ticking clock, I pictured my son standing in that distant courtroom. I imagined Michael wearing his expensive tailored suit, hiding behind a mask of fake grief, pretending to mourn the loss of his father's sanity. I wondered if his conscience bothered him at all, or if his soul had been completely bought and paid for by Jonathan's vast wealth. We skidded into the courthouse parking lot with only 3 minutes to spare. We sprinted up the concrete steps, completely ignoring the shouting security guards at the metal detectors. We navigated the maze of marble hallways, frantically searching for the specific courtroom listed on the municipal registry. We found the heavy wooden double doors at the very end of the corridor. Inside the quiet courtroom, Michael stood beside his high-priced corporate lawyer. The lawyer was currently addressing an older, stern-looking judge. I heard the lawyer confidently state that my absence today was tragic but undeniable proof of my severe cognitive decline and total inability to manage my own affairs. He politely asked the judge to issue an immediate default ruling in Michael's favor to protect me from myself. I did not wait for the judge to answer. I shoved the heavy wooden doors open so hard they slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack. Every head in the courtroom whipped around to face the entrance. I walked down the center aisle with Daniel right beside me, looking directly into my son's terrified eyes. Michael's face drained of color entirely. He gripped the edge of the defense table, looking as if he had just seen a ghost walk into the room. His corporate lawyer stammered, trying to object to our sudden, aggressive entrance, but Daniel did not give him a single second to speak. Daniel marched straight up to the judge's bench, opening his leather briefcase with precise, aggressive movements. He slammed my certified, notarized neurological evaluation directly onto the polished wood. He announced to the court that I had just passed a grueling 4-hour cognitive exam administered by the top neurologist in the state, proving my absolute mental competence. The judge picked up the medical affidavit, his expression shifting immediately from annoyance to intense scrutiny. Daniel did not stop there. He slammed down the federal historical preservation documents, proving that the land Michael desperately wanted to control was federally protected and completely unbuildable for commercial logistics. He explicitly stated to the judge that the conservatorship petition was nothing more than a fraudulent corporate land grab disguised as family concern. Finally, Daniel placed my secure tablet onto the bench and pressed play. He showed the judge the crystal-clear, high-definition security footage of Rachel planting illegal narcotics in my guest bedroom just hours prior. He explained that my son and his wife were actively attempting to frame me for a felony to guarantee this very conservatorship. The judge watched the video in total silence. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew terrifyingly cold. The judge lowered his glasses and glared directly at Michael with unchecked professional fury. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with a sharp, violent crack. He dismissed the emergency petition completely with prejudice, meaning Michael could never file it again. The judge explicitly warned Michael and his corporate lawyer that he was forwarding the video evidence of Rachel's planted narcotics to the district attorney for immediate criminal review. Michael collapsed into his chair, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic failure of his master plan. But the war was not won yet. Sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery was Jonathan. He did not flinch or rush forward to comfort his disgraced son-in-law. He simply stood up, his face a mask of cold, ruthless calculation. He stepped out into the busy courthouse hallway and pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket. If the legal system would not hand him my property, he would use the financial system to crush me entirely. Through the glass doors, I watched Jonathan make a swift, aggressive phone call. His face was twisted in rage as he barked orders into the receiver. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was contacting his corrupt bankers to activate the next phase of his assault. He ordered them to immediately accelerate the foreclosure on the forged $750,000 loan, demanding full payment in exactly 48 hours. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse had barely swung shut before Jonathan's ruthless retaliation reached my front porch. I had barely stepped out of my truck the following morning when a private courier marched up my gravel driveway. He handed me a thick manila envelope bearing the aggressive red stamp of the local bank. I tore open the seal and pulled out a formal notice of accelerated default. Jonathan had utilized his corrupt banking connections to call in the fraudulent loan immediately. The document demanded payment in full. I had exactly 48 hours to produce $750,000 in liquid cash, or the bank would seize my ancestral property. Jonathan thought he had backed me into an inescapable financial corner. He knew a retired carpenter could never produce that kind of capital in 2 days. What he did not know was that my actual wealth far exceeded his entire logistics empire. However, that wealth was deeply locked inside commercial real estate portfolios, shopping centers, and high-yield bonds. Liquidating $750,000 in less than 48 hours was technically possible, but it would trigger millions of dollars in capital gains taxes and severe financial penalties. Worse than the taxes, a massive, sudden liquidation would flag financial regulatory systems and immediately expose my true net worth to Jonathan and Michael. If they realized I was a multimillionaire, they would change their tactics and hire an army of forensic accountants to drag me into a decade-long legal war. I could not expose my hand yet. I needed to defeat Jonathan using his own arrogant playbook. I immediately called Daniel and told him to meet me at my house. He arrived looking completely exhausted, carrying a briefcase full of defensive legal motions that would take months to process through the backlogged court system. I poured him a cup of black coffee and told him to put the defensive paperwork away. I told him we were no longer playing defense. We sat at my kitchen table, the very same table where I had once taught Michael the value of an honest dollar. I laid the foreclosure notice flat on the wood and looked at my wealth manager. I explained that commercial debt is not a static object. It is a commodity. It can be bought, sold, and traded between financial institutions without the debtor's consent. Jonathan's corrupt bank manager, Arthur, was holding a highly toxic, legally disputed loan. If a private buyer offered to purchase that debt in pure cash, Arthur would leap at the opportunity to clear the liability from his local branch's ledger. Daniel stared at me, his eyes widening as he grasped the sheer audacity of my strategy. He asked how we could possibly fund a private acquisition without exposing my domestic real estate trusts. I smiled and instructed Daniel to open his encrypted laptop. I gave him the authorization codes to a massive offshore holding account I had established decades ago. During the late 90s, I finalized a highly lucrative commercial development deal and routed the profits into a secure blind trust located overseas. It was an account I had not touched in 20 years. It sat there quietly accumulating immense interest entirely disconnected from my name, my social security number, and my domestic tax records. The funds were completely untraceable. Daniel's fingers flew across the keyboard as he verified the massive balance. He looked up at me with profound professional respect. We were going to use my invisible offshore wealth to buy my own fraudulent debt, effectively cutting Jonathan completely out of the equation. Daniel worked through the night, utilizing his international legal contacts to execute the maneuver. By dawn, we had legally incorporated a completely anonymous shell corporation registered under the name Obsidian Holdings. The corporate officers were listed as proxy attorneys, creating an impenetrable wall of anonymity around the true owner. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Daniel's firm contacted the local bank branch representing Obsidian Holdings. They offered to purchase the $750,000 defaulted loan in pure, untraceable cash. Just as I predicted, the corrupt bank manager Arthur accepted the offer immediately. He was desperate to wash his hands of the messy, legally disputed forgery, especially after the disastrous courthouse failure the day before. The wire transfer cleared the international banking system within an hour. The official debt transfer documents were signed, sealed, and electronically filed with the county clerk. I sat in my quiet study looking at the digital confirmation on my secure server. The trap had been perfectly set. Obsidian Holdings now legally owned the massive debt that my son had fraudulently created. Because I was the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings, I was now the absolute owner of my own forged loan. I had effectively become Jonathan and Michael's direct, unforgiving creditor. I held the leash to their financial survival, and they had absolutely no idea that the noose was already tightening around their necks. Later that afternoon, Jonathan received an automated notification from the local bank informing him that a ruthless, faceless offshore hedge fund had purchased the debt on my property. According to the tracking software Daniel installed, Jonathan did not panic. In fact, he celebrated. In his overwhelming arrogance, Jonathan believed that an aggressive, anonymous corporate entity would be far more efficient at evicting a stubborn old man than a local bank constrained by community optics. He assumed Obsidian Holdings would send armed sheriffs to throw me out into the street by the end of the weekend. He felt utterly victorious, convinced his master plan to steal my ancestral land had finally succeeded through a stroke of corporate luck. To celebrate his perceived triumph over me, Jonathan decided to throw a lavish, extravagant gala at his sprawling estate that Saturday night. He sent out embossed invitations to the city's wealthy elite, eager to parade his success and flaunt his dominance. He had no idea that he was throwing a celebration for his own impending destruction. Jonathan did exactly what an arrogant man with unearned power always does when he believes he has won. He threw a party. By Tuesday afternoon, his sprawling suburban estate was buzzing with event planners and florists. He sent out embossed invitations to the city elite, eager to parade his fabricated success and flaunt his dominance over my family land. He had no idea he was rolling out the red carpet for his own impending destruction. I had no intention of sitting at home while he celebrated stealing my heritage. I needed to be inside that house to gather the final piece of evidence required to lock the federal trap permanently. Getting onto the guest list was impossible, but becoming invisible to the wealthy was incredibly easy. For 40 years, I built custom homes and negotiated commercial leases across this county. I knew every contractor, every vendor, and every service provider in the area. I made a quiet phone call to an old friend who owned the premier luxury catering service Jonathan had hired for his gala. My friend owed me a massive favor from decades ago when I helped keep his struggling business afloat during a severe economic recession. I did not ask him for money or legal help. I simply asked him to put my name on the staffing roster and leave a freshly pressed catering uniform in the back of his delivery van. On Saturday evening, I pulled my truck into a dark commercial parking lot 2 miles away from Jonathan's estate. I changed out of my worn flannel and pulled on the crisp black slacks and the stiff white button-down shirt of a high-end server. I tied the black silk apron around my waist and climbed into the back of the catering van, blending in perfectly with the working-class invisible army hired to serve the elite. The catering van bypassed the main security gate and parked near the sprawling service entrance at the back of Jonathan's mansion. I stepped out into the cool night air holding a polished silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. I walked through the swinging kitchen doors and stepped directly into the lion's den. The massive ballroom was overflowing with local politicians, corrupt banking executives, and corporate vultures, all dressed in bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. The string quartet played a lively symphony, entirely drowning out the sound of my quiet footsteps on the marble floor. I moved through the crowded room with practiced, deliberate grace. I had spent my entire life building the very rooms these people occupied, but tonight I was nothing more than a silent ghost in a crisp white shirt. The wealthy guests looked right past me as I offered them drinks. They reached for the champagne glasses without making eye contact, completely ignoring the man holding the tray. To them, I was not a retired commercial real estate mogul holding the absolute deed to their host's entire financial future. To them, I was just a nameless, faceless servant meant to blend into the wallpaper. I walked past the corrupt bank manager Arthur, who was laughing loudly and accepting a cigar from a local judge. Neither of them recognized the man they had attempted to financially strangle just days prior. I kept my head bowed and my posture subservient, allowing their inherent class bias to render me entirely invisible. I navigated the perimeter of the grand room, keeping a careful eye on the main staircase leading to Jonathan's private quarters. I saw Michael standing near the towering fireplace, looking deeply uncomfortable in his tailored suit. He forced a smile as the wealthy guests patted him on the back, congratulating him on securing his financial future. My son had no idea he was being paraded around as the sacrificial lamb for the very people shaking his hand. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for the boy I had raised, but I pushed the emotion aside. He had made his choice. I continued moving toward the east wing of the estate, expertly balancing the silver tray while scanning the security layout. I needed to reach Jonathan's private study located down a quiet mahogany-paneled hallway far away from the noisy celebration. I set my silver tray down on a narrow console table just outside the main ballroom and slipped quietly down the dim east corridor. The heavy bass of the string quartet faded into a muffled hum as I approached the heavy oak doors of Jonathan's private study. I checked over my shoulder to ensure no security guards were patrolling the hallway. I turned the brass knob and slipped inside the dark, quiet room, pulling the door shut behind me with a soft click. The study smelled of aged leather and expensive scotch. I moved quickly behind Jonathan's massive desk, reaching into the pocket of my uniform. Daniel had provided me with a highly advanced military-grade micro-recording device. It was no larger than a coin, designed to capture crystal-clear audio from anywhere in the room. I reached under the polished wood of the desk and pressed the adhesive backing firmly against the underside of the central drawer. I tapped the small activation button twice, feeling a tiny vibration confirming the device was transmitting directly to the secure earpiece hidden deep inside my right ear. I stood up to survey the room, ensuring everything looked exactly as I found it. Suddenly, I heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps and sharp high heels clicking rapidly down the hallway. The brass doorknob began to turn. I had less than 2 seconds to react. I silently sprinted across the thick Persian rug and slipped behind the heavy velvet drapes, masking a deep window alcove just as the oak doors swung open. Jonathan strode into the room, followed closely by my daughter-in-law, Rachel. They did not turn on the main chandelier. Jonathan simply switched on a small desk lamp, casting long, harsh shadows across the walls. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold window glass, entirely concealed within the dark folds of the heavy velvet fabric. Through the tiny wireless earpiece, I captured every single word they spoke with terrifying clarity. Jonathan poured himself a drink and let out a cold, cruel laugh. He told Rachel that the offshore hedge fund buying the debt was the greatest stroke of luck they could have possibly asked for. He explained his final master plan with absolute ruthless precision. He told his daughter that the moment the faceless hedge fund evicted me and seized the historic property, his corporate lawyers would step in and purchase the land for pennies on the dollar through a subsidiary firm. Rachel asked him what they were going to do about Michael. Jonathan sneered, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. He explicitly stated that the moment the federal banking authorities investigated the initial fraudulent loan, he was going to hand them the entire folder of forged documents. He planned to throw my son completely under the bus, framing Michael as the sole mastermind behind the bank fraud. Jonathan promised Rachel that Michael would take the fall and serve 10 years in federal prison, leaving Jonathan with absolute ownership of the land and zero legal liabilities. My own daughter-in-law simply smiled and agreed to destroy her husband. The heavy oak door clicked shut as Jonathan and Rachel left the study. I stepped out from behind the thick velvet drapes into the dim room. The tiny earpiece hidden in my right ear still hummed with the ambient static of their retreating footsteps. I reached under the mahogany desk, retrieved the micro-recording device, and slipped it safely into my uniform pocket. The encrypted audio file was already securely transmitted to Daniel's off-site server, locking the federal trap permanently into place. I possessed the ultimate proof of Jonathan's treachery. I held the digital key that would dismantle his entire logistics empire and send him and his ruthless daughter directly to a federal penitentiary. I could have simply walked out. The back service door, climbed into the catering van, and let the authorities handle the rest. I could have easily let Michael take the fall for the forgery. He had stolen my signature. He had tried to strip me of my human rights through a corrupt court. He had stood by while I was humiliated in the dirt. But the cold, hard logic of a tactical legal strike warred with the agonizing reality of a father's heart. Despite the towering mountain of betrayal, Michael was still my blood. I remembered the little boy who used to help me carry lumber, the boy who looked at me with absolute trust before the poison of unearned wealth infected his soul. I realized I could not let him walk blindly into a slaughterhouse without offering him one final exit. I had to give him a singular definitive chance to save himself from total destruction. If he chose to listen to the truth, I would protect him from the fallout. If he chose his father-in-law over reality, I would finally wash my hands of him. I adjusted my catering apron, took a deep breath to steady my racing pulse, and slipped back out into the bustling hallway to find my son. I navigated the perimeter of the grand ballroom, carefully avoiding the gaze of the intoxicated elite. I spotted Michael standing alone near the glass doors leading out to the estate's sprawling garden. He looked exhausted, nursing a glass of amber bourbon, completely isolated despite being surrounded by hundreds of wealthy guests. I pushed through the heavy glass and stepped into the cool night air. The manicured garden was dimly lit with strings of fairy lights and towering silver heat lamps. I approached him quietly from the shadows. I did not wear the subservient posture of a waiter anymore. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, and called his name softly. Michael spun around, his eyes widening in pure shock as he recognized the face beneath the catering uniform. Before he could shout or summon the private security, I grabbed him firmly by the elbow and pulled him behind a tall, thick row of manicured hedges, completely shielding us from the view of the main house. He tried to yank his arm away, demanding to know what I was doing, sneaking around his father-in-law's property, dressed like a common servant. I told him to keep his mouth shut and listen very carefully, because his actual life depended on the next 60 seconds. I pulled my secure mobile device from my pocket, synced it to the raw audio file Daniel had just processed, and held the speaker up between us. I pressed play. The unedited recording of Jonathan and Rachel filled the quiet space. Jonathan's cold, cruel voice outlined his master plan with terrifying clarity. He explained exactly how he was going to hand the forged loan documents over to the federal banking authorities the moment the heat turned up. He explicitly stated that Michael would take the sole fall, serving 10 hard years in a federal penitentiary, leaving Jonathan with absolute ownership of my ancestral land and zero legal liabilities. Then came Rachel's voice. The woman Michael slept next to every night offered a soft, chilling laugh and simply agreed to destroy her husband without a second thought. I watched Michael's face as the audio played. I watched the color drain from his cheeks. I watched his eyes dart wildly as the undeniable truth of his pathetic, disposable existence within this family was laid completely bare. I paused the recording and looked him dead in the eye. I offered him my hand one last time, telling him to walk away with me right now and I would protect him from the impending federal indictment. Michael stared at the phone in my hand, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The absolute truth was staring him right in the face, but his desperate desire for Jonathan's approval had become a terminal disease. He could not accept that he had traded his soul and betrayed his own father for a family that viewed him as nothing more than a convenient, disposable scapegoat. Instead of breaking down, instead of apologizing and grabbing my hand to escape Michael's face contorted into a mask of pure frantic denial, he slapped the phone violently out of my grip. It fell onto the grass, but I did not bend down to retrieve it. Michael backed away, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. He furiously accused me of using artificial intelligence to fabricate the voices. He claimed I was a bitter, jealous old man trying to ruin his marriage and sabotage his brilliant corporate career out of sheer spite. He shouted that Jonathan loved him like a real son, and that Rachel would never betray him. The psychological delusion was absolute and unbreakable. He had built his entire adult identity around their wealth, and he would rather burn alive in their fire than admit he had been played for a fool. His voice rose into a hysterical, broken scream, echoing across the quiet garden, shouting for the private security guards. He publicly accused his own father of violently stalking him, screaming that I had broken into a private event to physically attack him. The utter finality of his choice settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. The boy I had raised was truly dead. Within seconds, 3 burly private security guards rushed around the hedges, followed closely by 2 uniformed police officers hired for event security. Michael pointed at me hysterically, demanding I be arrested immediately for criminal trespassing and harassment. The officers moved in swiftly, grabbing my arms and twisting them behind my back. I did not resist. I stood perfectly still as the cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists. I kept my head held high, looking past the officers and up toward the grand balcony of the master suite. Standing there, illuminated by the soft glow of a wall sconce, was Jonathan. He looked down at the garden, watching me being hauled away by law enforcement. A smug, triumphant smile spread across his face. He held a sleek silver tablet in his hand. Through the glass doors, I knew exactly what he was doing. With me securely detained in police custody and utterly defenseless, Jonathan tapped the screen, executing the final property seizure protocol online. He finalized the transfer, believing he had just crushed my entire existence and stolen my family history. As the officers shoved me into the back of a squad car, I looked away from Jonathan and stared at my son one last time, knowing that the ultimate trap had finally been sprung. The heavy steel doors of the precinct holding cell slammed shut behind me with a hollow metallic clang. I sat down on the cold steel bench. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, relentless hum. My wrists still throbbed from the tight metal handcuffs, but the physical discomfort was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, chilling emptiness settling inside my chest. I stared at the dirty concrete floor and reflected on the long, painful journey that had brought a 70-year-old retired carpenter to a county jail cell in the middle of the night. I had built my entire life around the fundamental belief that a father must provide for and protect his family at all costs. I gave Michael every conceivable opportunity to choose the truth over a comfortable lie. I pulled him aside in that garden. I played the raw, unedited audio of his own wife and father-in-law plotting to destroy his life and send him to a federal penitentiary. I offered him a clear, safe exit from their toxic web. Instead of grabbing my hand, Michael chose the poison. He chose the tailored designer suits, the exclusive country club memberships, and the fleeting approval of an arrogant man who viewed him as disposable garbage. He chose to look his own father in the eye and publicly brand me a violent, deranged stalker. As I sat alone in that freezing cell, I realized the time for paternal mercy had officially expired. I could no longer treat him like a misguided child who needed rescuing. He was a grown man who had actively participated in a criminal conspiracy to steal my ancestral home. The father who would sacrifice everything for his boy died in that garden. Only the architect of their destruction remained. A bored-looking police officer finally walked up to the steel bars and informed me that I was allowed one phone call. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my stolen catering uniform, and walked over to the battered wall phone mounted at the far end of the corridor. I did not call a criminal defense attorney to beg for my freedom. I dialed the direct secure line of my wealth manager. Daniel answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and completely awake despite the late hour. He had been monitoring my mobile tracking beacon and already knew I was inside the county precinct. I did not waste a single second explaining the humiliating scene in the garden or the false trespassing charges Michael had weaponized against me. I kept my voice incredibly low and absolutely steady. I told Daniel that the window for any peaceful negotiation was permanently closed. I gave him the exact authorization phrase we had agreed upon when we first established Obsidian Holdings. I told him to execute Protocol Zero immediately. I heard Daniel take a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He understood the catastrophic gravity of that command. Protocol Zero was not a defensive legal maneuver. It was a scorched earth financial protocol designed to absolutely obliterate Jonathan's entire logistics empire and sever his access to every single dollar he possessed. Daniel did not hesitate. He assured me the trap was completely armed and waiting for the final trigger. He explained that his team of offshore corporate attorneys was already positioned across 3 different global time zones, ready to initiate the worldwide asset seizure the second the legal parameters were met. He told me to sit tight and let the local police process my paperwork, because the real war was currently shifting to the digital banking sector. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver and walked back to my steel bench. I leaned my head against the cold concrete block wall and closed my eyes, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. Jonathan thought locking me in a cage would render me defenseless. He had no idea that my silence was simply the final countdown to his total financial annihilation. I sat in that cramped holding cell for 6 hours, listening to the chaotic sounds of the night shift slowly transition into the quiet routine of the early morning. Just before dawn, broke the heavy steel door of the cell block, buzzed loudly, and slid open. The booking officer called my name and told me my bail had been posted in full. I collected my personal belongings and walked out into the brightly lit precinct lobby. Daniel was standing near the front desk, wearing a sharp navy suit, holding his leather briefcase and looking intensely focused. We walked out through the double glass doors and stepped into the cool, crisp morning air. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a pale orange glow across the empty police parking lot. Daniel unlocked his black luxury sedan and we climbed inside. Before he even started the powerful engine, he turned to me with a look of absolute grim satisfaction. He informed me that while I was sitting in a concrete cell, Jonathan was busy securing his own doom. Daniel explained that just an hour ago, Jonathan received the final debt restructuring contracts from Obsidian Holdings regarding the massive forged loan. Believing he had successfully eliminated me from the playing field, Jonathan was eager to finalize his absolute control over my ancestral land before the local banks opened for business. He electronically signed every single page of the dense commercial agreement using his verified corporate credentials. Jonathan made the ultimate and fatal mistake of a profoundly arrogant man. He was so blinded by his perceived victory and his hatred for me that he did not bother to have his expensive legal team read the dense, highly complex addendums buried at the very back of the Obsidian Holdings contract. Daniel had expertly drafted a ruthless cross-collateralization clause hidden deep within the boring legal jargon. By signing that specific commercial agreement, Jonathan legally bound his own private logistics firm, his offshore bank accounts, and his personal suburban estate as direct collateral against the fraudulent $750,000 loan. He unknowingly triggered an irrevocable transfer of deeds, handing absolute control of all his personal and corporate assets directly to my anonymous shell company. Jonathan fully believed he was signing the final paperwork to steal my grandfather's 50 acres. In reality, he had just willingly signed away his entire life, his wealth and his legacy to the very man he had thrown in jail. The trap was locked, and the key was thrown away. The illusion of his immense power was completely shattered on paper. All that remained was for the international banking system to process the digital signatures and execute the total seizure. I looked at Daniel and nodded. It was finally time to watch Jonathan's world burn. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse had barely swung shut before Jonathan executed his ruthless retaliation. I had just stepped out of my truck the following morning when a private courier marched up my gravel driveway. He handed me a thick manila envelope bearing the aggressive red stamp of the local bank. I tore open the seal and pulled out a formal notice of accelerated default. Jonathan had utilized his corrupt banking connections to call in the fraudulent loan immediately. The document demanded payment in full. I had exactly 48 hours to produce $750,000 in liquid cash, or the bank would seize my ancestral property. Jonathan thought he had backed me into an inescapable financial corner. He knew a retired carpenter could never produce that kind of capital in 2 days. What he did not know was that my actual wealth far exceeded his entire logistics empire. However, that wealth was deeply locked inside commercial real estate portfolios, shopping centers, and high-yield bonds. Liquidating $750,000 in less than 48 hours was technically possible, but it would trigger millions of dollars in capital gains taxes and severe financial penalties. Worse than the taxes, a massive sudden liquidation would flag financial regulatory systems and immediately expose my true net worth to Jonathan and Michael. If they realized I was a multimillionaire, they would change their tactics and hire an army of forensic accountants to drag me into a decade-long legal war. I could not expose my hand yet. I needed to defeat Jonathan using his own arrogant playbook. I immediately called Daniel and told him to meet me at my house. He arrived looking completely exhausted, carrying a briefcase full of defensive legal motions that would take months to process through the backlogged court system. I poured him a cup of black coffee and told him to put the defensive paperwork away. I told him we were no longer playing defense. We sat at my kitchen table, the very same table where I had once taught Michael the value of an honest dollar. I laid the foreclosure notice flat on the wood and looked at my wealth manager. I explained that commercial debt is not a static object. It is a commodity. It can be bought, sold, and traded between financial institutions without the debtor's consent. Jonathan's corrupt bank manager was holding a highly toxic, legally disputed loan. If a private buyer offered to purchase that debt in pure cash, the manager would leap at the opportunity to clear the liability from his local branch ledger. Daniel stared at me, his eyes widening as he grasped the sheer audacity of my strategy. He asked how we could possibly fund a private acquisition without exposing my domestic real estate trusts. I smiled and instructed Daniel to open his encrypted laptop. I gave him the authorization codes to a massive offshore holding account I had established decades ago. During the late 90s, I finalized a highly lucrative commercial development deal and routed the profits into a secure blind trust located overseas. It was an account I had not touched in 20 years. It sat there quietly accumulating immense interest entirely disconnected from my name, my social security number, and my domestic tax records. The funds were completely untraceable. Daniel's fingers flew across the keyboard as he verified the massive balance. He looked up at me with profound professional respect. We were going to use my invisible offshore wealth to buy my own fraudulent debt, effectively cutting Jonathan completely out of the equation. Daniel realized the brilliance of the maneuver. By purchasing the debt, we would not be paying off the loan to free Michael from his forgery. We would be assuming the position of the lender. We would hold the absolute power to dictate the terms of repayment or default. I told Daniel to initiate the wire transfer immediately, ensuring the funds move through 3 different international clearinghouses to completely obscure their origin. Daniel worked through the night, utilizing his international legal contacts to execute the maneuver. By dawn, we had legally incorporated a completely anonymous shell corporation registered under the name Obsidian Holdings. The corporate officers were listed as proxy attorneys, creating an impenetrable wall of anonymity around the true owner. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Daniel's firm contacted the local bank branch representing Obsidian Holdings. They offered to purchase the $750,000 defaulted loan in pure, untraceable cash. Just as I predicted, the corrupt bank manager accepted the offer immediately. He was desperate to wash his hands of the messy, legally disputed forgery, especially after the disastrous courthouse failure the day before. The wire transfer cleared the international banking system within an hour. The official debt transfer documents were signed, sealed, and electronically filed with the county clerk. I sat in my quiet study looking at the digital confirmation on my secure server. The trap had been perfectly set. Obsidian Holdings now legally owned the massive debt that my son had fraudulently created. Because I was the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings, I was now the absolute owner of my own forged loan. I had effectively become Jonathan and Michael's direct, unforgiving creditor. I held the leash to their financial survival, and they had absolutely no idea that the noose was already tightening around their necks. By purchasing the commercial paper, I bypassed the local courts entirely. If Michael or Jonathan tried to contest the validity of the loan, they would be fighting a multi-billion-dollar international hedge fund, not a retired carpenter. They were legally obligated to repay Obsidian Holdings, and I was going to collect every single penny. Later that afternoon, Jonathan received an automated notification from the local bank informing him that a ruthless, faceless offshore hedge fund had purchased the debt on my property. According to the tracking software Daniel installed, Jonathan did not panic. In fact, he celebrated. In his overwhelming arrogance, Jonathan believed that an aggressive, anonymous corporate entity would be far more efficient at evicting a stubborn old man than a local bank constrained by community optics. He assumed Obsidian Holdings would send armed sheriffs to throw me out into the street by the end of the weekend. He felt utterly victorious, convinced his master plan to steal my ancestral land had finally succeeded through a stroke of corporate luck. To celebrate his perceived triumph over me, Jonathan decided to throw a lavish, extravagant gala at his sprawling estate that Saturday night. He sent out embossed invitations to the city's wealthy elite, eager to parade his success and flaunt his dominance. He had no idea that he was throwing a celebration for his own impending destruction. The flashing blue and red lights of 2 municipal police cruisers reflected off the front windows of my quiet home. I sat in my study watching the live feed from my exterior security cameras with a cup of black coffee in my hand. Rachel had arrived. She stormed up my gravel driveway, flanked by 2 broad-shouldered police officers. She did not bother to knock. She pounded her fists against my heavy oak front door, screaming at the top of her lungs. I could hear her shrill, hysterical voice penetrating the thick walls of my ancestral house. She demanded the officers break down the door and drag me out in handcuffs. She yelled that I was a dangerous, deranged cybercriminal who had maliciously hacked into her family's private banking network and stolen her entire fortune. She claimed I was a bitter, jealous old man trying to destroy her perfect life out of pure spite. She paced frantically back and forth on my porch, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the wooden floorboards. She ordered the police to draw their weapons, treating them like her own personal private security force. The officers looked visibly uncomfortable, but they were obligated to investigate a claim of massive financial theft, especially when the accuser came from a highly influential local family. They asked her to step back so they could announce their presence officially. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and picked up the heavy leather binder Daniel had prepared for me. I did not rush. I let Rachel scream for another full minute, letting her exhaust her frantic, manic energy before I finally walked down the hallway to answer the door. I unbolted the heavy deadbolt and pulled the front door open. Rachel immediately lunged forward, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, screaming at the officers to arrest me on the spot. I did not raise my voice or react to her erratic behavior. I looked past her frantic gestures and politely addressed the 2 police officers. I calmly invited them inside my home out of the cold air so we could resolve the hysterical accusations in a civilized manner. The officers exchanged a hesitant glance but stepped over the threshold, bringing a hyperventilating Rachel with them. I led them into my well-lit, pristine dining room and motioned for them to stand near the large oak table. I placed my heavy leather binder flat on the wood and opened it. I told the officers I completely understood why this woman was currently experiencing a severe mental breakdown, but I assured them I was not a cybercriminal. I pulled out the certified watermark documents from Obsidian Holdings. I laid the crisp pages out in a neat row. I calmly explained that her father, Jonathan, had not been hacked by a rogue computer genius. I explained that Jonathan had willingly and legally signed a highly complex commercial debt restructuring agreement just a few hours ago. I pointed directly to Jonathan's verified electronic signatures at the bottom of the contracts. I directed the officers' attention to the specific cross-collateralization clauses highlighted in bright yellow ink. I explained in clear, undeniable terms that Jonathan had blindly leveraged every single one of his personal and corporate assets to secure a fraudulent loan. By defaulting on the catastrophic terms he had willingly signed, he triggered an automatic, irrevocable transfer of his entire estate. The officers leaned over the table reading the dense legal jargon. They saw the official federal banking stamps, the registered corporate seals, and the undeniable proof of absolute legal compliance. They realized instantly that no theft had occurred. A multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition had simply been executed flawlessly on paper. Jonathan had not been robbed. He had been legally outmaneuvered by a completely legitimate financial institution. I watched the realization wash over the officers' faces. They looked at the documents and then looked at Rachel, realizing she was not a victim of a crime, but the beneficiary of a man who had just bankrupted himself through his own sheer unchecked arrogance. The shift in the room was immediate and profound. The officers stood up straight, stepping away from the dining table and turning their attention directly toward Rachel. The lead officer crossed his arms and asked her a very specific, targeted question. He asked if she was fully aware of the origins of the initial $750,000 loan her father was attempting to secure. Rachel stammered, her face flushing a deep, guilty red. I stepped forward and provided the officers with the missing context. I pulled the forensic audit out of my folder and laid it next to the Obsidian contracts. I explained that the original loan was secured using my forged signature on stolen property deeds. I told the officers that Rachel and Jonathan were actively conspiring to use that fraudulent money to fund their lavish lifestyle and ultimately strip me of my ancestral land through a fake conservatorship. The officers reviewed the audit, tracing the flow of stolen funds directly to accounts bearing Rachel's name. They realized they were not standing in the home of a cybercriminal. They were standing in the very same room as an active accomplice to a massive multi-million-dollar racketeering and bank fraud scheme. The lead officer rested his hand on his utility belt, his tone shifting from polite inquiry to stern law enforcement protocol. He informed Rachel that attempting to file a false police report while actively benefiting from a forged commercial loan constituted a severe federal felony. He advised her that she had the right to remain silent, and that anything she said from this moment forward would be used against her in a court of law. The color completely drained from Rachel's face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Cornered and absolutely terrified by the very real threat of spending a decade in a federal penitentiary, Rachel made her ultimate and most predictable move. The loyalty she claimed to have for her husband evaporated the second her own freedom was threatened. She began to hyperventilate, shaking her head violently as she backed away from the officers. She shrieked that she had absolutely nothing to do with the forgery, claiming she was just an innocent bystander manipulated by greedy men. She reached frantically into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick, hidden folder. She slammed it onto my dining table right next to the Obsidian contracts. She looked directly at the police and declared that her husband, Michael, was the sole mastermind behind the entire operation. She opened the folder to reveal dozens of practice sheets filled with my forged signature and internal emails proving Michael had executed the fraudulent bank transfer himself. She handed the police the exact physical evidence required to send her husband to federal prison, throwing the man she supposedly loved completely under the bus, without a single second of hesitation, just to save her own skin. Rachel handed the evidence to the officers, ensuring her own survival. The wheels of justice moved with terrifying speed. Michael was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table in his downtown corporate headquarters. He was leading a high-stakes board meeting surrounded by junior executives who hung on his every word. He wore his tailored Italian suit, projecting the absolute aura of an untouchable corporate elite. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom did not just open, they were shoved wide by 4 armed federal agents wearing tactical vests. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The lead agent did not lower his voice or offer any professional courtesy. He marched directly up to the head of the table and commanded my son to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Michael tried to utilize his arrogant, wealthy persona, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion and threatening to call Jonathan's corporate lawyers. The agent simply grabbed Michael by the shoulder, spun him around, and snapped cold steel handcuffs over his expensive silk cuffs. The agent read him his rights loudly, detailing the charges of federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and multi-million-dollar racketeering. The junior executives watched in absolute horror as their untouchable leader was publicly stripped of all his manufactured dignity. The illusion of his powerful life shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. He was frog-marched through the busy corporate bullpen, paraded past dozens of his own employees who pulled out their phones to record his devastating downfall. He was shoved into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, leaving his entire fabricated world completely destroyed. Less than an hour later, Michael found himself sitting in a freezing, windowless interrogation room at the federal building. The pristine, tailored suit he took so much pride in was now wrinkled and soaked in nervous sweat. He sat on a rigid metal chair, waiting for Jonathan's army of high-priced defense attorneys to burst through the door and rescue him. He fully believed his father-in-law would deploy every resource available to protect the family name. The heavy steel door finally opened, but no lawyer stepped inside. Two seasoned federal detectives walked in carrying thick, expanding files. They did not offer him a glass of water or a chance to explain himself. They sat down across the metal table and slid a heavy manila folder directly in front of him. It was the exact same folder Rachel had frantically pulled from her designer handbag on my front porch just a few hours prior. The detectives opened the cover, revealing dozens of practice sheets covered in my forged signature alongside internal corporate emails that unequivocally proved Michael had personally executed the fraudulent bank transfer. Michael stared at the documents, his mind struggling to comprehend the catastrophic reality staring him in the face. He recognized his wife's specific organizational tabs. The detectives explained with brutal clarity that his loving wife and his powerful father-in-law had formally cooperated with the authorities. They informed Michael that Rachel and Jonathan had set him up as the solitary mastermind behind the entire criminal enterprise. They had meticulously curated a paper trail designed to frame him for every single illegal transaction, isolating him as the sole scapegoat to protect their own wealth and freedom. The absolute truth of my garden warning hit him like a freight train. He remembered the raw, unedited audio recording I had played for him behind the hedges at the gala. He had accused me of fabricating the voices. He had called me a bitter, jealous old man. Now, sitting in a bleak concrete room, he realized his father had been the only person trying to save his life. The sheer weight of his monumental foolishness crushed whatever arrogance he had left. The very people he had sold his soul to impress had thrown him completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He realized he was entirely alone, facing a decade in a federal penitentiary while his wife walked free. I was sitting on the wooden porch of my ancestral home when my cell phone finally began to vibrate. I looked at the caller identification. It was an automated prompt from the local federal detention center indicating an inmate was attempting to place a collect call. I accepted the charges and brought the receiver to my ear. Michael's voice came through the line thick with panic and choked with humiliated tears. The arrogant corporate executive who had laughed in my face just days ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, broken boy begging his father for sanctuary. He sobbed into the receiver, admitting that I was right about everything. He told me Rachel and Jonathan had completely abandoned him, leaving him to face the full wrath of the federal government alone. He had finally pieced together the magnitude of my hidden commercial real estate empire after the detectives revealed the Obsidian Holdings acquisition. He begged me to use my massive wealth to post his exorbitant bail and hire the absolute best criminal defense team money could buy. He pleaded for me to rescue him from the nightmare he had built, promising he would do anything I asked if I just got him out of that freezing concrete cell. He swore he had learned his lesson and desperately needed his real family to save him from total destruction. He rambled frantically, making promises he could not possibly keep, claiming we could rebuild our relationship once he was safely back in his own home. He assumed that my parental love was a bottomless well he could endlessly exploit. He still believed that a simple apology and a few tears could erase the fact that he had tried to strip away my human rights and steal the very land my grandfather had bled for. I listened to his desperate crying without interrupting. I did not raise my voice or offer any comforting platitudes. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke with absolute chilling finality. I refused to pay a single penny of his bail. I told him that true salvation requires total accountability, and no amount of my hidden wealth was going to shield him from the consequences of his own treacherous choices. I explained that he would sit in that cold federal cell and face the harsh reality of the bed he had made. I laid out a singular, uncompromising ultimatum. He would remain behind bars until the criminal trial commenced. He would take the witness stand in open court and testify fully against Jonathan and Rachel, detailing every single aspect of their racketeering syndicate. I told him if he tried to protect them or refused to take absolute responsibility for his role in the forgery, I would leave him to rot in federal prison for the next 10 years. I hung up the phone, disconnecting the line and leaving my son alone with the silence. The federal courthouse buzzed with a tense electric energy as the high-profile racketeering trial officially commenced. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with local journalists, financial reporters, and curious onlookers eager to witness the downfall of a major corporate dynasty. I sat in the second row wearing a tailored navy suit, projecting absolute calm while the storm raged around me. Jonathan sat at the defense table, flanked by a team of the most expensive, ruthless corporate defense attorneys money could buy. They had spent weeks carefully crafting a narrative designed to shield the logistics chief executive from any legal fallout. Michael sat at a separate table, separated from his father-in-law by a wide aisle, looking pale and entirely defeated. When the defense attorney delivered his opening statement, his strategy became crystal clear. He paced in front of the jury box, using sweeping theatrical gestures to paint a picture of a devastating family betrayal. He completely ignored the mountain of evidence linking Jonathan to the fraudulent loan. Instead, he focused entirely on Michael. The lawyer painted my son as a greedy, ambitious opportunist who had abused his position within the family to orchestrate a massive financial crime behind everyone's back. He argued that Jonathan was simply a trusting father-in-law who had welcomed a young man into his home only to be maliciously deceived. The attorney claimed that Michael forged the documents, manipulated the bank transfers, and set up the shell companies entirely on his own. It was a brilliant, terrifying manipulation of the facts. They were throwing Michael to the wolves to ensure Jonathan walked out of that courtroom a free man. The defense called Jonathan to the witness stand on the third day of the trial. He walked up the wooden steps with a slow, measured gait, deliberately projecting the image of a weary, heartbroken patriarch. He wore a conservative gray suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He swore to tell the truth and immediately launched into a masterful, flawlessly executed performance. Under the gentle guiding questions of his own defense attorney, Jonathan began to weave a complex web of lies. He spoke about how he had treated Michael like his own flesh and blood, welcoming him into his corporate empire with open arms. He let his voice crack perfectly on cue, describing the sheer devastation he felt when he supposedly discovered the fraudulent loan. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his dry eyes, shedding crocodile tears for the jury. Jonathan testified that he was completely ignorant of the forged signatures and the fake demolition orders. He claimed that Michael had leveraged his executive access to bypass the company internal security protocols. He painted my son as a master manipulator who utilized his intimate knowledge of my historic property to orchestrate the theft without Jonathan or Rachel ever suspecting a thing. He even brought his daughter into the lie, claiming Rachel was currently seeking intense psychiatric therapy to cope with the profound trauma of her husband's deceit. He described the moment the federal agents raided his office, acting as though he was a victim of a shocking, unforeseen betrayal. He looked directly at the jury box, shaking his head in mock sorrow, stating that he had trusted the wrong man with his family's future. It was a sickening display of sociopathic arrogance. He sat under oath and committed perjury with the absolute confidence of a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. He painted Michael as a calculating monster who was willing to destroy his own father to climb the corporate ladder, while presenting himself as the tragic, innocent casualty of a greedy son-in-law. He sold the lie with such profound conviction that even I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift dangerously. I watched the jurors lean forward in their heavy leather chairs, captivated by Jonathan's emotional performance. Several of them nodded sympathetically, completely absorbed by the fabricated tragedy of a betrayed father. The defense team was successfully manipulating the emotional narrative, turning the undeniable forensic evidence into a confusing blur of corporate scapegoating. It looked as though Jonathan might actually win their sympathy and secure a devastating acquittal. I shifted my gaze to the other defense table. Michael sat frozen in his chair, gripping his hands together so tightly his knuckles were bone white. The sheer terror radiating from his posture was palpable. He looked around the vast wood-paneled room, realizing that his father-in-law's high-priced attorneys were expertly constructing a cage built entirely for him. He understood that if the jury believed this masterful lie, he would absorb the full weight of the federal indictment. He would face a decade in a maximum security penitentiary, while the man who engineered the entire criminal enterprise walked away without a single scratch. The illusion of his powerful corporate life had completely dissolved, leaving him exposed and utterly defenseless against a billionaire's legal machine. The prosecution objected multiple times, trying to break the momentum of Jonathan's testimony, but the defense lawyers expertly deflected every single challenge. The tide was turning rapidly, and the federal prosecutors looked visibly frustrated by the sudden emotional sway of the courtroom. The defense finally rested their case, leaving a heavy, lingering silence in the grand courtroom. The lead federal prosecutor stood up from his table, adjusting his suit jacket with a renewed sense of purpose. He addressed the judge and announced that the state wished to call a final rebuttal witness to definitively clarify the origins of the conspiracy. He called my name loudly. I stood up from the gallery, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. A murmur rippled through the packed benches as I walked steadily down the center aisle. I did not look at Jonathan or acknowledge his sudden rigid posture on the witness stand. I approached the heavy wooden gate carrying a secure encrypted digital tablet in my right hand. I raised my right hand, swore an oath to tell the absolute truth, and took my seat in the witness box. I placed the black tablet flat on the ledge in front of me. It contained the raw, unedited audio recordings I had captured while hiding in the shadows of Jonathan's private study during the gala. The moment for absolute accountability had finally arrived. The heavy wooden gates of the witness box clicked shut behind me. I sat in the leather chair, smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit, and looked directly at the jury. The lead federal prosecutor approached the podium and asked me to state my name and occupation for the record. I told them I was Oliver Grant, a retired carpenter, and the sole proprietor of a commercial real estate holding firm worth over $900 million. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Jonathan's head snapped up, his meticulously crafted facade of a betrayed victim slipping for the very first time. I answered every question the prosecutor asked with absolute clarity. I detailed the 40-year history of my silent wealth. I explained how I worked double shifts framing houses in the brutal summer heat, placing every extra dollar into a blind trust to build a financial fortress for my family. I described how I secured my grandfather's 50 acres under federal historical protection, knowing greedy men would eventually try to steal it. Then I outlined exactly how Jonathan's unchecked arrogance had been his ultimate downfall. I explained the creation of Obsidian Holdings, the offshore shell corporation I used to legally purchase the fraudulent debt he had orchestrated. I detailed how Jonathan blindly signed the commercial debt restructuring agreement, unknowingly triggering a cross-collateralization clause that legally transferred his entire logistics empire, his personal bank accounts, and his sprawling suburban estate directly into my complete control. The jury listened in stunned silence as I dismantled the billionaire's lie piece by piece. Jonathan had believed his wealth made him a predator, but he was nothing more than a foolish fish swimming directly into a finely woven net. The prosecutor approached the bench and requested permission to submit State Evidence Exhibit 42. He took the secure encrypted digital tablet from my hands and connected it directly to the courtroom audio system. He informed the judge and the jury that they were about to hear a raw, unedited recording captured inside Jonathan's private study on the night of his victory gala. The prosecutor pressed play. The crackle of static filled the cavernous room, followed instantly by the unmistakable, cruel voice of Jonathan. The jury heard him laughing coldly as he explained his master plan to his daughter. They heard him explicitly outline how he would hand the forged loan documents over to the federal banking authorities the moment the heat turned up. He proudly detailed how he would frame Michael as the sole mastermind behind the massive bank fraud, ensuring his son-in-law would take the fall and serve 10 hard years in a federal penitentiary. The recording captured Jonathan boasting that Michael's imprisonment would leave him with absolute ownership of the ancestral land and zero legal liabilities. Then the audio shifted. The clear, sweet voice of Rachel echoed through the courtroom speakers. The jury listened in absolute horror as the woman Michael slept next to every single night offered a soft, chilling laugh and enthusiastically agreed to destroy her husband to protect her inheritance. The audio recording stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The courtroom erupted in shock. Reporters scrambled to take notes. The jury members stared at the defense table with undisguised disgust. Jonathan's face completely drained of color, turning a sickly pale gray. His crocodile tears evaporated. His expensive corporate defense attorneys slumped in their chairs, refusing to look at their client. The airtight narrative they had spent weeks building was entirely incinerated in less than 2 minutes. The truth was out, and it was devastating. The prosecution dismissed me from the stand, and I returned to my seat in the second row of the gallery. The defense attorneys for Jonathan declined to cross-examine me, terrified of making the situation any worse. It was time for the final testimony. Michael was called to the witness stand. He walked down the aisle with a slow, heavy step, but as he passed my row, he looked me in the eye. He saw the strength I had maintained throughout this entire ordeal, and for the first time in his adult life, he decided to stop cowering behind the wealth of corrupt men. He took the oath and sat in the witness box. Emboldened by the undeniable truth I had just laid bare, Michael finally acted like a man. He delivered a comprehensive, devastating confession. He did not make excuses for his actions. He looked directly at the jury and admitted that he had forged my signature on the commercial loan documents. However, he detailed exactly how Jonathan had coerced him into the fraud, leveraging Michael's massive hidden corporate debts and threatening to destroy his career if he did not comply. Michael exposed the entire criminal syndicate, outlining how Jonathan manipulated the local banking channels and used Rachel to keep Michael psychologically compliant. He took absolute, unforgivable responsibility for his own weakness and his betrayal of his father, but he made sure the jury knew exactly who held the puppet strings. His testimony was the final nail in Jonathan's coffin. The trial concluded rapidly after Michael stepped down from the stand. The defense attorneys offered weak, disjointed closing arguments, completely unable to overcome the forensic audio evidence and the damning testimonies. The federal prosecutor delivered a crushing final statement, reminding the jury that corporate greed and profound arrogance do not place any man above the law. The judge handed over the final instructions, and the jury filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The waiting period was incredibly brief. The massive weight of the evidence left absolutely no room for reasonable doubt. Less than 3 hours later, the court bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The gallery scrambled back into their seats, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the judge took his seat, his expression grave and unyielding. He banged his wooden gavel against the sounding block, demanding absolute silence in the court. He ordered the defendants to stand and face the jury as the foreman handed the folded paper to the bailiff. The final life-altering verdicts were about to be read, and the empire of glass and arrogance was officially coming to an end. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the fate of the people who had tried to destroy me. The court bailiff walked across the polished floor, handing a stack of folded papers directly to the presiding judge. The entire room held its collective breath. The silence was so profound, I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the jury box. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the verdict forms. His expression was entirely devoid of sympathy. He ordered the defendants to rise and face the court. Jonathan stood up on trembling legs, his expensive custom-tailored suit looking suddenly 2 sizes too big for his deflated posture. Rachel stood beside him, her face completely drained of color, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the defense table to keep from collapsing. The judge did not hesitate. He read the verdicts with a booming, authoritative voice that echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. On the federal charges of aggravated elder fraud, the jury found both Jonathan and Rachel guilty. On the charges of grand larceny and conspiracy to commit bank fraud, the jury found them guilty. On the final and most severe charge of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar racketeering syndicate, the verdict was a resounding and unanimous guilty. The crushing weight of those words slammed into the defense table. Jonathan and Rachel were no longer wealthy, untouchable socialites hiding behind gated suburban mansions. They were officially convicted federal felons facing decades behind bars. Their empire of glass and arrogance had been entirely dismantled by the truth. I sat in the second row of the gallery, watching the exact moment their fabricated reality completely shattered. The absolute finality of the judge's voice left absolutely no room for appeals or high-priced legal maneuvers. The trap had closed perfectly. The immediate aftermath of the guilty verdicts was a scene of absolute chaotic destruction. The facade of their loving, wealthy family evaporated in an instant. Rachel turned toward her father, her face contorted in a mask of pure, vicious hatred. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the judge's demands for order in the court. She blamed Jonathan for dragging her into his reckless financial schemes, cursing him for destroying her perfect life and losing her inheritance. Jonathan did not remain silent. He snapped back with equal venom, his face flushing a dangerous dark red. He shouted that Rachel was a weak, ungrateful accomplice who had willingly thrown her own husband to the wolves the second she felt cornered. The illusion of their sophisticated high-class bond dissolved into a pathetic, vulgar screaming match. The judge slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block, ordering the federal marshals to clear the defendants from the room. 4 heavily armed officers stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. They grabbed Jonathan and Rachel roughly by the arms, twisting them backward and locking the metal cuffs around their wrists with a sharp, terrifying click. The wealthy executives who had once forced my son to his knees in the dirt were now being physically dragged out of the courtroom, kicking and screaming like common street criminals. The heavy doors slammed behind them, cutting off their hysterical shouting and leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the gallery. The judge took a deep breath, adjusting his robes and turning his sharp gaze toward the secondary defense table. Michael sat there completely alone. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed deeply toward his chest. The federal prosecutor stepped up to the podium to outline the sentencing guidelines for my son. Michael had pled guilty to his role in the conspiracy and the forgery of the commercial loan documents. The prosecutor stated clearly that despite his cooperation on the witness stand, the mandatory federal guidelines for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud carried a maximum penalty of 10 hard years in a federal penitentiary. Michael closed his eyes, squeezing them shut as if bracing for a physical blow. He was terrified. He knew he had absolutely no legal leverage left. He had surrendered his corporate career, his marriage, and his entire reputation. Now he was staring down the barrel of a decade locked inside a concrete cage. The judge looked down at his notes, preparing to deliver the final sentencing mandate that would send my son to federal prison. I knew I had to act. I stood up from the hard wooden bench in the gallery, smoothing the front of my navy suit. I projected my voice across the quiet room and formally requested permission to address the court before the final ruling was declared. The judge paused, looking at me with a measure of profound professional respect. He granted my request and invited me to step forward. I walked past the low wooden gate and stood directly behind my son. Michael kept his head bowed, unable to look me in the eye due to the crushing weight of his shame. I addressed the judge clearly and without a trace of emotional fragility. I stated that I was not standing there out of blind parental weakness or a misguided desire to protect a criminal from the consequences of his actions. I told the court that my son had committed an unforgivable betrayal against his own blood. He had stolen my signature and attempted to strip me of my basic human rights. However, I reminded the judge that when cornered, Michael did the one single thing Jonathan and Rachel absolutely refused to do. He took total, unmitigated accountability for his crimes. He provided the crucial, devastating testimony required to completely dismantle a massive predatory criminal syndicate. He handed the federal prosecutors the exact evidence needed to put 2 ruthless masterminds behind bars. I looked directly at the judge and requested leniency for my son. I asked the court to recognize his cooperation and spare him from a decade in a federal cage, not because he deserved an easy escape, but because the state owed him a debt for his absolute transparency on the witness stand. The judge listened carefully to my statement, resting his hands on the polished wood of his high bench. He looked down at Michael, studying the broken, defeated man sitting at the defense table. The judge announced that the court recognized the unprecedented value of the testimony provided. He stated that while the crimes committed were severe, the cooperation yielded a significant victory for federal law enforcement. The judge struck his gavel and delivered the final ruling. He sentenced Michael to 5 years of rigorous federal probation, bypassing the mandatory prison time entirely. However, the mercy came with strict, agonizing conditions. The judge mandated 3,000 hours of grueling manual community service. Michael was officially stripped of all his corporate financial licenses and permanently barred from holding any executive fiduciary positions. He was physically free from the threat of iron bars, but his life as he knew it was entirely eradicated. Michael walked out of the courtroom a free man, but he was a convicted federal felon with a completely ruined reputation and absolutely nothing to his name. The empire of glass he had sold his soul to inherit was gone, leaving him to face the unforgiving reality of starting over from total scratch. The panic in Carlos's eyes was genuine, but my mind was already dissecting the architecture of their attack. Juliet believed she could outsmart me using the very legal system I had spent the last 2 years mastering through the Aurora Hughes Foundation for the Protection of Seniors. She assumed my silence was a vulnerability. She forgot exactly who she was dealing with. "Show me the digital footprint," I commanded, walking briskly behind my heavy oak desk. Carlos placed his encrypted tablet on the surface. The screen displayed a critical banking alert. The fraudulent power of attorney bore a perfect replication of my signature alongside Ethan's verified authorization, granting Juliet's new fiancé immediate administrative control over the foundation's primary operating account. Ethan stared at the glowing screen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He collapsed into the guest chair, his hands pulling frantically at his hair. He confessed that during their eviction from the suburban apartment, Juliet had handed him a stack of financial separation papers. In his desperation to keep the peace and finalize the separation, he had blindly signed every page without reading the fine print. She had weaponized his profound weakness to forge a blade against me. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer my son a comforting embrace. My late husband Robert always said that visible wealth attracts problems, but invisible wealth gives you power. I had taken those words to heart when I built my commercial empire, and I had applied the exact same uncompromising philosophy to my charitable organization. "Carlos, you have nothing to fear," I stated, maintaining absolute chilling composure. "They did not freeze our capital. They walked directly into a federal vault. 6 months ago, I restructured our financial hierarchy. That operating account is a decoy ledger linked directly to the Federal Oversight Committee." Carlos exhaled a sharp breath as the realization washed over his face. By utilizing a forged document to intercept funds belonging to a registered charity, Juliet and her wealthy real estate developer had not committed a simple domestic theft. They had just committed aggravated wire fraud across interstate banking lines. "Initiate the lockdown protocol," I instructed Carlos, my voice echoing with icy finality. "Contact our liaisons at the Federal Trade Commission immediately. Provide them with the exact IP address of the device that initiated the freeze and forward the forged power of attorney to the district attorney's office." We did not wait in the office for the authorities to handle the situation. I grabbed my coat and ordered Ethan to follow me. We drove in silence to the sleek downtown high-rise where Juliet's new fiancé managed his luxury real estate firm. The receptionist tried to stop us, but I bypassed her desk completely and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the executive suite. Juliet was sitting on a plush leather sofa, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass. She looked exactly as she had on her wedding day, immaculately dressed, deeply arrogant, and utterly certain of her triumphant victory. Her new fiancé, a tall man wearing a bespoke suit and a patronizing smirk, stood behind his polished mahogany desk. "Aurora, you should have stayed in your modest apartment," Juliet sneered, placing her glass down on the marble table. "Your precious foundation is bankrupt. If you ever want to see your grandson again, you will liquidate the trust fund you set up for Oliver and transfer the entire balance into my personal account by the end of the day." I walked directly up to the desk. I did not blink. I placed the federal banking audit printout right over his expensive leather blotter. I told Juliet that she had severely miscalculated her position on the chessboard. I explained that she had not seized my wealth, but rather triggered an automatic federal investigation that was currently freezing every single asset tied to her fiancé's name. The smug confidence vanished from the developer's face in a fraction of a second. He snatched the paper from the desk, his eyes darting frantically across the official government seals and the uncompromising legal language. He looked at Juliet with pure, unfiltered rage, realizing instantly that she had lied to him about the origin of the documents and the true extent of my financial fortifications. "You used a forged signature to attack a federally protected charity," I stated, ensuring every syllable cut through the silent room like a blade. "The authorities are already securing warrants for your arrest. Your real estate firm is finished, and your personal accounts are seized pending a criminal racketeering trial." Juliet began to scream hysterically. She pointed a trembling finger at the man beside her, viciously blaming him for the failure exactly as she had blamed Ethan when their unsustainable lives fell apart 2 years ago. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy romance dissolved instantly into a pathetic, vulgar screaming match. I did not stay to watch them tear each other to pieces. I turned my back onto the chaos and walked toward the elevator. Ethan followed me closely, his head bowed in profound shame. He had finally witnessed the true catastrophic cost of greed and the unyielding strength required to defeat it. The trust fund I had created for Oliver's college education remained perfectly secure, administered by Carlos, and completely untouchable until the boy turned 18. I stepped out of the cold glass building into the bright afternoon sun, knowing that my family's legacy was finally safe. The silence that surrounded me was profound, and it was entirely my own. The most profound lesson to extract from this ordeal is that unconditional love must never equate to unconditional tolerance for abuse. We confuse maternal sacrifice with a willingness to endure endless disrespect. Society conditions parents, particularly mothers, to believe that our primary purpose is to absorb the failures and toxic behaviors of our adult children to maintain the facade of a united family. However, true love sometimes requires the courage to let those we cherish face the harsh consequences of their own actions. When you shield a person from the repercussions of their greed, you do not protect them. You actively participate in their moral corruption. Financial abuse within families is an insidious disease because it is consistently disguised as familial duty or concern. Relatives will weaponize your affection, convincing you that handing over your assets is the only way to prove your love. They measure your worth by the depth of your pockets rather than the content of your character. The moment you recognize this dynamic, you must realize that your dignity is not a negotiable currency. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of survival and personal respect. Furthermore, this story illustrates the immense power of silent strength. Visible wealth often attracts opportunistic predators, while invisible wealth grants you the ultimate leverage. You do not need to shout to establish authority, nor do you need to display your resources to command respect. True power lies in observation, meticulous planning, and the absolute refusal to be treated as disposable. When you remove the emotional blindfold and look at your family members as flawed individuals, rather than idealized versions of who you want them to be, you reclaim control over your own life. Ultimately, blood relations do not automatically guarantee loyalty, empathy, or respect. True family is forged through mutual care and integrity. If the people who share your DNA choose manipulation over honesty, you possess the absolute right to walk away. Rebuilding your life in peace, even if it means walking alone, is infinitely better than living in a crowded room where you are constantly diminished. You must never apologize for protecting your secured legacy and your mental health. Your ultimate duty is not to finance the entitlement of ungrateful heirs, but to safeguard your own peace, preserve your dignity, and defend your right to a serene life. Always choose yourself first.